This is the 14th and, as they say, penultimate lecture in the course, and it's the last one where I have a substantial amount of material to draw your attention to from the database. We want to cover the Dutch side of Dutch and German skepticism, and I've chosen as a representative Abraham Kuenen. You'll see why in a moment. But before I get onto this, I want to just draw your attention to an 18th century author, Joseph Butler, and something that he has to say about the nature of cumulative evidence. This is from part 2 of the Analogy of Religion, chapter 7. He's been talking about the fact that the evidence for Christianity consists of a great many particulars, and it has to be seen as a whole in order to have its cumulative effect properly estimated. And he writes, "It is obvious how much advantage the nature of this evidence gives to those persons who attack Christianity, especially in conversation. For it is easy to show in a short and lively manner that such and such things are liable to objection, that this and another thing is of little weight in itself, but impossible to show in like manner the united force of the argument in one view." I think you'll see by the time we're done why that's a good epigraph for today's lecture, where we're going to see a real contrast in approaches between Kuenen and Stanley Leathes. Dutch and German skepticism, just to review, centered in Germany, where the work of F.C. Baur started a school of thought at Tübingen in its first phase, influenced by Hume's anti-supernaturalism and very heavily by Hegel. I think you'll see the influence of Hume's anti-supernaturalism in Kuenen, even though Kuenen never mentions Hume by name. Was transplanted into England by translation of works of various authors, and this is especially true of Kuenen, who wrote largely in Dutch. His works translated into English had quite an impact on English work and thought. It was challenged in its New Testament side by some historical discoveries, but Kuenen's argument is going to have more to do with the Old Testament prophets and prophecy, and with their relation to quotations from the Old Testament in the New. Let's briefly survey some of the dialectic regarding prophecy so that we have a proper sense of the matrix into which these authors write and are contributing. On the positive side, some passages in the Old Testament appear to correspond to persons and facts of much later date, indicating a supernatural foresight due to divine inspiration. It's important that we understand that on the pro side, it was maintained that some of the prophets spoke of more than they themselves understood. And we'll see that that becomes a point of contention between the pro and the con. On the con side, there are alternative interpretations of those passages that are exegetically preferable, and crucially, no prophecy can have a meaning other than that given to it by the one who utters it. The impulse behind the negative case here is to treat the literature of ancient Israel like the literature of ancient Babylon or the literature of ancient Sumeria. Any other ancient civilization, we would take a wholly philological approach to their writings. We must do the same thing with the writings of Israel. And we'll see, again, sort of a tension that comes up between the two opposing camps on this point as we move forward. Again, on the positive side, Jesus and his disciples applied many such passages to his own life. The negative rejoinder is that those passages in particular are wrenched out of context and given a meaning that we can tell they do not have. But on the positive side, the authority of Jesus and his disciples as interpreters of the Old Testament is substantiated, above all, by his resurrection. Here, the argument from miracles and the argument from prophecy intersect. If the resurrection is a fact, then that sheds a definite light on the way that we take Jesus' pronouncements about Old Testament prophecy. On the negative side, the rejoinder is the resurrection of Jesus is a pious legend and cannot serve as a justification for a particular reading of the Old Testament. That will serve to bring us, I think, to an understanding of where Abraham Kuenen is coming from. He was a Dutch Orientalist, scholar of multiple Oriental languages, influenced early on by Ewald and later by Bishop Colenso, of whom we've already heard. He's best known for his work, The Prophets and Prophecy in Israel, which was written in 1875 and translated in 1877 into English. But he also penned a revealing pair of essays on critical method. A new journal, the Modern Review, came out in 1880, and in its first number, it contained in 2 parts this essay on critical method by Kuenen. And a lot of things that he says there are more revealing because they're more concentrated. They're all put in one place than anything that you would glean by just skimming over his longer works. So this is a very important pair of essays. I have found them. I will post them in the group on Facebook later. John is working to try to see if HathiTrust has a copy of Modern Review, and if it does, he'll put up a link to that as well. The main points in Kuenen's approach follow the con side of the argument over prophecy. The historical material in the Old Testament is mingled with a large measure of myth and legend. In this respect, he absolutely follows along with Colenso. The laws attributed to Moses are a later development, and their historical setting is a fictional afterthought. Here, not only Colenso, but also Graff and Wellhausen are the influences on his thought. Crucially, Old Testament prophecy was never supernaturally predictive, and in particular, it was not predictive of the events recorded in the New Testament. Kuenen goes so far as to say that the difference between a prophet and a false prophet is a difference of degree only. It's merely that those now regarded as prophets had a loftier level of purely human inspiration and a fine moral sense, and it's the moral teaching, after all, that matters. In fact, in a very revealing passage, I didn't type this out, but I'll read it to you. Kuenen says, and this is quoted in a footnote, actually, in one of Leathes' books. Let me see if I can just pull it up. It's in the introduction. He talks about the question, suppose that all that the Old Testament prophets were writing was not divinely inspired, had no reference to anything beyond their own setting, their own historical Sitz im Leben. Here from page 593 of The Prophets and Prophecy. He says, thus, then, the crown which a later generation had placed upon the brows of the Israelitish prophets is, in our time, removed. But, stripped of that supernatural halo with which they glittered, they reveal all the more clearly their own personal greatness. But we have then no longer in their prophecies the word of God himself, which we, in common with the Christian church of all ages, thought that we possessed in them. Do not lament that. Each of their words that finds an echo in your own heart and your conscience, and their number is great, is to you a word of God. Think for a moment of the people that we've read about, talked about during this course. Of whom does that remind you? Reminds me of Emerson. It doesn't matter if God's not really literally speaking. It is to you a word of God if it finds an echo in your heart and your conscience. What, then, if it finds no echo? What should we say of it then? Here's Kuenen writing about critical scholarship. Very important concession he makes in this first essay on critical method is that there is no secret specialized knowledge driving the project. He's very explicit about that. The Bible is in everyone's hand. The critic has no other Bible than the public. He does not profess to have any additional documents inaccessible to the laity, nor does he profess to find anything in his Bible that the ordinary reader cannot see. It is true that here and there he improves the common translation, but this is the exception, not the rule. It is not some proprietary piece of scholarship that separates the critical scholar from the common man. He's going to go on and describe the critical method, but he asks, When we have described the critical method, must we not go on to justify it? No. Not at all, he says. It will have to justify itself by its own simplicity. Note the appeal to the simplicity of the critical method. For him, that is all the justification it needs, and it is enough. All right? What is the critical method? Well, first and foremost, it is the method of literary criticism. Literary criticism is primary. Wherever the external testimonies, here he means testimonies regarding the age or the authorship of a document, come into conflict with the substance and form of the document, judgment must be given for the latter and against the former. Notice how sweeping that statement is. He doesn't say, sometimes when the external testimonies come into conflict, judgment must go the one direction rather than the other. He says, wherever they come into conflict, the substance and form of the document dominate. The tradition may rest upon a misconception or even upon intentional deceit, but the document itself that lies before us cannot deceive us, and we must therefore go by what it tells us. So literary criticism of the specific kind that he's going to employ always trumps external evidence, which does raise a very interesting question. What if we're wrong about what the document tells us? What if we are mistaken? What if what seems to be something that lies upon the face of the document is actually arrived at by an inference? And what if there are other premises necessary for that inference? You'll see, I think, in a few minutes, why that question becomes such a burning one, especially for someone who's going to place the entire weight of the argument on literary criticism and sweep aside anything that tradition may tell us for that. There's a fundamental principle involved in treating prophetic scriptures in particular. No prophecy ever means anything more or other than the human writer or speaker intends. Here it's interesting to contrast this with the Jewish understanding of prophecy shown to us in John 11:49 through 51. Caiaphas says, "You know nothing at all. It's expedient for us that one man should die for the nation." And then the gloss that the evangelist gives to this is, "This, he said, speaking more than he knew, for he was the high priest that year." In other words, someone in a particular role may say something that is more true than he knows, has an application he is not aware of, directly contrary to Kuenen's fundamental principle. Now, let's see how he applies his principle. So Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, the servant of the Lord. Well, he says, obviously, Isaiah can't be thought to be seeing through time to the coming of Christ. Therefore, we have to find a different interpretation. The best interpretation left over is that the servant of the Lord is a term for the righteous Israelites collectively. This, he argues, in the prophets and prophecy in Israel. Now, here he has the support of the medieval Jewish interpreters, who frequently did say this. But there's an old Targum that predates the Christian era that paraphrases this passage beginning in Isaiah 52, and it says, "Behold, my servant the Messiah shall deal prudently." So there's an older strand of Jewish interpretation that did indeed take this as messianic and referring to an individual, not as collective. Psalm 22, he says, "The poet suffers as a pious servant of Yahweh. He is one of many, and utters a common complaint and prayer in their name." That's how we're going to explain away Psalm 22. It's not a reference to the crucifixion. Jesus' use of the opening lines of Psalm 22 may have been a pious fraud perpetrated by the evangelist, but in any event cannot make us for a moment believe that the psalmist was looking forward in time and seeing someone else. Therefore, we have to interpret it as best we can. Apart from that, and he thinks the most plausible interpretation is that some of the phrases speak of the collective pious servants of Yahweh. So, what's the fundamental assumption? Here we have something from Heinrich von Seibel that's quoted with approval by Kuenen in his essay on critical method. Pay close attention to this. It's worth thinking about. The assumption with which all certainty of knowledge stands or falls is that the development of all earthly things follows absolute laws, and that they constitute together one connected whole. For did this unity not exist, or were it subject to any infringement, we could place no reliance upon any conclusion drawn from the connection of events, and every calculation of human motives would be relegated to chance. Thus, both the sources of historical knowledge would be destroyed. The existence of the historical, as of all other sciences, extends just so far as the recognition of the reign of law. Here, there's a very strong parallel to some statements that Baden-Powell makes, both in The Order of Nature and in his contribution to Essays and Reviews. I'm not saying that von Seibel got it from Baden-Powell. I am saying that it was very much in the intellectual atmosphere of the time, and that both of them seem to have picked that up in that way. Now, again, very importantly, this assumption trumps other forms of evidence. So here from the same essay, Kuenen says, "It often happens that our investigation into the character and qualifications of the witnesses would compel us to accept a fact for which they vouch, and yet the historical connection forbids us to admit it." So the testimonial evidence may be very strong, but the historical connection will overrule that. And in all cases, when there's a conflict of this kind, it's to be settled in favor of the continuity of historical causes. All of us, without distinction, reject miracles wherever we find them, except in the history of Israel and of the establishment of Christianity. The assertion that this exception in favor of the biblical miracles is justified by the greater weight of evidence in their favor is so notoriously contrary to the facts as to deserve no serious refutation. And in fact, he's going to give it no serious discussion at that point. He goes on, "The truth is that these special miracles are admitted as facts because they are in one way or another intertwined with people's religious belief, whether they are supposed to furnish its foundations or in their turn are supported by their harmony with it. Hence it is that the controversy as to the miracles will never be decided on the field of historical investigation. The real ground of their recognition as facts lies not there. This is not a matter of greater historical knowledge. It's a matter of the philosophical preconceptions one brings to the study of history." So Kuenen's very explicit about this. Now, I think it's fair to say that this is the point at which rational discussion of the issue breaks down. Kuenen's critics, and Leathes is a good type of those critics, insist on the great difference in evidence. Kuenen says it's not even worth discussing. There is no such difference. So if he's not going to give the evidence serious consideration, then what does he do? Well, he offers a psychological diagnosis for the persistence of such beliefs. He is not saying that the historical evidence isn't good because see here, see there. Instead, he's saying, no, brush all that aside. You just say that because it's bound up with your most revered beliefs. We'll come back to that in a little while. Actually, I thought of C.S. Lewis's essay on Bulverism at this point, and maybe some of you also thought of it. You must, Lewis says, show that a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. The modern method is to assume without discussion that he is wrong and then distract his attention from this, the only real issue, by busily explaining how he became to be so silly. How did you wind up believing in these miracles? Well, you did it because you already believed in Christianity, or you already believed in Judaism. This, Lewis says ironically, is the foundation of the modern mind. Now, Kuenen protests. He says, in a long quotation, that he is actually looking for neutral ground, and he says he's not ruling out miracles. So here's a quotation from his essay on critical method. "Without for a moment concealing my own conviction that there is not one single miracle on record which we can accept as a fact, I would nevertheless place in the forefront of historical criticism the principle that miracles are possible. To this principle I have never been consciously untrue while pursuing the very path which has led me to the conviction I have just avowed. I shall not therefore reject miracles a priori, without discussion and without distinction, but shall enter in perfect good faith, and not simply as a matter of form, upon the investigation of the credibility of even a miraculous story." In perfect good faith. With regard to every such story, we have to face this question when we have completed the preliminary investigation. Which is more probable? That a veritable miracle lies at the basis of the miraculous story? Or that it has grown up under the action of this or that well-known cause without any foundation in miraculous fact? The staunchest believer in miracles, if he admits discussion at all and seeks to be reasonable in his faith, can hardly object to the question when put in this form. He, too, must accept the more probable of two alternatives in this, as in all other cases. Here, then, we have found the common ground we sought. And I think someone like Leathes would have said, exactly, nothing could be more reasonable. Let's see how you approach the probabilities when it comes to the question of a miraculous, a supernatural versus a non-supernatural interpretation of a particular fact. Well, in the religion of Israel, he gives us an example of this. The probability that a departure from the natural order of things must be placed to the account of tradition or of the narrator in accordance with analogy, for traditions and narrators often inflate these things, is infinitely greater than the probability that such a departure really occurred in opposition to all analogy. In other words, he's perfectly prepared to weigh up the probabilities, but perhaps you should be warned in advance that the probability of any naturalistic explanation is going to be infinitely greater than that of any explanation that invokes the supernatural. Kuenen's contemporary, and in many ways his indefatigable opponent, was the English theologian and Orientalist Stanley Leathes, an Anglican priest, professor of Hebrew. Leathes had the distinction of giving series of lectures on each of the major foundations that supported apologetic lectures in the 19th century. He was the Boyle lecturer, the Halcyon lecturer, the Bampton lecturer, and the Warburton lecturer. And in particular, in the Warburton lectures, he takes on Kuenen quite directly because Kuenen had attacked him by name, though only in passing, in some of his earlier work. So on the Prophets and Prophecy in Israel, Kuenen had dismissed Leathes in a couple of footnotes as just a representative of the old kind of criticism that could not really be critical and could not even understand the critical position. There is no detailed engagement with any of Leathes' arguments. So Leathes' basic approach to prophecy can be summed up like this. There are sundry features of the Old Testament that, read in the light of subsequent events, receive an amount of unexpected illustration that is novel, striking, and unique. This is not presupposing that they are supernatural. It's starting looking at them as documents and saying, this is very striking. That's a datum, that there is this set of correspondences, that these passages look this way, take on this new coloring. How should we account for that datum? It's a fact. What does it tell us? Here's another example of his method of arguing. The portrait of Jesus presented in the Gospels could not by any possibility have owed its origin to the scattered and fragmentary sketches of a Messiah to be found in the Old Testament, if for no other reason, at least for this, that in many cases it is not by any means clear that they referred or were understood to refer to a Messiah. That oftentimes prior to the corresponding facts there was no possibility that they should be so understood, that the facts therefore alleged to correspond could not have been suggested by the particular scriptures or invented in order to correspond with them. Take, for example, the famous passage in Isaiah 7, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive," quoted in Matthew chapter 1. There is no record surviving for us that this was considered by the Jews to be a messianic prophecy. And we do have quite an extensive literature encompassing hundreds of passages that tells us what the Jews did consider to be messianic in their own scriptures. So it is not credible to say Matthew, remembering a messianic prophecy in Isaiah 7, invented a story of a virgin birth to go along with it. Rather, it seems as though the event drove Matthew back into the Old Testament looking for references that might have been hidden in there and laying there unbeknownst to us until light was shed on them by the coming of the Messiah. So Matthew is reading backwards. How does Leathes deal with particular passages? Well, for Isaiah 52, he says, and again, you have to realize that he has Kuenen in view here. "In like manner assert, if you will, that the 53rd chapter of Isaiah has spoken of the nation. The assertion carries within it its own refutation. He hath laid on him the iniquity of us all." On the nation? The iniquity of the nation? That doesn't make any sense at all. So you can't actually get away with that interpretation. By the way, the argument that Leathes is making here is also found in Paley's view of the evidences of Christianity in the part where he's considering the subsidiary arguments. The argument from prophecy, he rests entirely on Isaiah 53. He says he's not going to get into the details of others, but he's willing to rest the whole case on that one passage. Or take Hosea 11:1. Now here's an interesting point where Leathes is absolutely willing to agree that this is not something Hosea conceived of as predictive of a Messiah. To take one instance of the application of this scientific exegesis, which is of a crucial nature because it is advanced with triumphant confidence, St. Matthew applies to our Lord the words of Hosea, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." Now, it is admitted freely and at once that Hosea was speaking of the historic exodus and of that only. But is that any proof whatever that when the evangelist appropriates his words, he does not thereby legitimately give them a fullness of meaning, which till he so used them they neither had nor could have had? Hosea wasn't intending to speak of the Messiah and didn't realize that what he was doing might be so applied, but there is a real correspondence, a resonance, if you will, and it did not catch God by surprise. And Matthew, looking backward, was inspired to find it. This is very much of a keeping with the Jewish conception of the proper interpretation of their own scriptures. There are patterns in things, and we may happen to see the pattern in some cases, not to see it in others, but God sees it at all times, and God has placed those patterns there for a reason. If we catch on to a pattern and we realize that something more was going on than ever we thought, that is not misreading. That may be an appropriate understanding of what God intended us to see in the fullness of time. Leathes continues to highlight the fundamental question. He's pretty unsparing on this point. The method of the critics, he says, is vitiated by the arbitrariness of their principles. I am not able to discern any standard of judgment to which they are willing to submit their own judgment, but their principles appear to me to be so arbitrary that I cannot but suspect a certain vitiation in the argument also on their side, if only it should arise from the pious and wholesome dread of supernaturalism. So you'll see exactly where Leathes is laying the stress here. Kuenen, of course, says that he has no objection in principle to the possibility of the supernatural, but in fact his principles have laid it beyond the reach of evidence. And this pious and wholesome dread, he's deliberately invoking a sort of language that had been thrown at the more orthodox, traditional Christians. This wholesome dread of the supernatural has driven them to do things that could not be otherwise supported. It's really all being driven from below by their resistance to the supernatural. I'd like to close today's lecture with a long quotation from one of C.S. Lewis's essays. This essay goes by a couple of different titles. One of them is Fern Seed and Elephants, and the other is Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. It's under that latter title that you'll find it in his collection, God in the Dock. And I think it is a nice bookend to this conversation because it makes the point that Leathes has been making, and it makes it in a way that really does highlight a certain view of what's going on, a view that Leathes and Lewis would have shared. Here's what Lewis says. The sort of statement that arouses our deepest skepticism, and here by our, Lewis means the layman, the non-specialist. He's ranging himself with the non-specialists, is the statement that something in a gospel cannot be historical because it shows a theology or an ecclesiology too developed for so early a date. For this implies that we know, first of all, that there was any development in the matter, and secondly, how quickly it proceeded. It even implies an extraordinary homogeneity and continuity of development, implicitly denies that anyone could have greatly anticipated anyone else. This seems to involve knowing about a number of long-dead people, for the early Christians were, after all, people, things of which I believe few of us could have given an accurate account if we had lived among them. All the forward and backward surge of discussion, preaching, and individual religious experience, I could not speak with similar confidence about the circle I have chiefly lived in myself. I could not describe the history even of my own thought as confidently as these men describe the history of the early church's mind. And I'm perfectly certain no one else could. Suppose a future scholar knew that I had abandoned Christianity in my teens, and that also in my teens I went to an atheist tutor. Would not this seem far better evidence than most of what we have about the development of Christian theology in the first 2 centuries? Would not he conclude that my apostasy was due to my tutor, and then reject as backward projection any story which represented me as an atheist before I went to the tutor? Yet he would be wrong. I am sorry to have become once more autobiographical, but reflection on the extreme improbability of his own life by historical standards seems to me a profitable exercise for everyone. It encourages a due agnosticism, for agnosticism is, in a sense, what I am preaching. I do not wish to reduce the skeptical element in your minds. I am only suggesting that it need not be reserved exclusively for the New Testament and the creeds. Try doubting something else. Kuenen, of course, reposes the utmost confidence in what the text tells us. And he's very sure that he knows what the text tells us, even a text written by someone removed by millennia from him in a culture that is not his own, in a language that is not his own. Lewis is encouraging us to a due agnosticism about these things. Lewis goes on in this essay to say that various literary critics have attempted to divine the origin of some of his ideas. And so far as he can recall, he says they have a 100% failure rate. So here are Englishmen, his own contemporaries, writing in his language, sharing his culture, making conjectures very confidently about the origin of his ideas, what lay in his mind as he was writing a certain thing. And in every single case, they got it wrong. They also get it wrong with regard to other people. For example, there were people who wrote about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings that the ring represented the atomic bomb. And what could be more probable? Here was a work that was issued just after World War II. There was a weapon of unimaginable power, madness to fail to use, and yet utterly fatal to try to use. What could be more likely than that Tolkien had that in mind? But no, the origin of Tolkien's ideas actually predates that and had nothing to do with the atomic bomb. That was an interpretation that the critics thought they could see lying in the text, but that wasn't true.